Thank you, Sierra, and welcome to each and every one of you. And thank you so much for joining our special session today titled An Honesty Gap, Shifting State Standards and Accountability for Learning Loss Recovery. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, as it is often referred to, it's often referred to as the nation's report card because it is the one national report that gives us a broad look at how our kids are doing academically across the country. In recent years, the report has caused concern as it showed that students have not been catching up since the pandemic, which is especially troubling given the major federal investment in support of learning recovery, the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER as it's known. There's also been controversy about what many see as grade inflation, with students getting all Bs despite NAEP indicating that they are nowhere near that level of achievement. About a year ago, CGLR held a webinar in partnership with Learning Heroes featuring their new report called B-Flation, How Good Grades Can Sideline Parents, that explored this issue. The report includes data on parent perspectives from research conducted by Gallup that shows that 8 out of 10 parents report that their child is getting mostly Bs or better, and that parents most often rely on report cards to know whether their child is performing at grade level. Most importantly, the data indicates that parents who say their child is below grade level in reading or math are much more likely to discuss academic topics with teachers, and that their concerns increase with more information, and that then they are more likely to take action in support of their child's learning progress. So beyond grades in the classroom, the complexity and confusion around information about student performance has been compounded by state departments of education shifting their standards so that what qualifies as proficient in one state may be vastly different from what NAEP calls proficient. This means that the cut scores, or the mark on assessments that indicate academic proficiency, is moving in various states, and parents are left perplexed about what their children's scores actually mean, how well their children are doing, and whether they need to get extra help or support. This difference between states' cut scores and NAEP has been referred to as the honesty gap, or the gap between what info is available to parents and how their kids are actually doing. Linda Jacobson at the 74 published an article at the end of last month, already been posted in the chat, I'll post it again, that explores this issue, and we thank her for the information and sort of thought partnership in planning the session today. And now we have this awesome chance to unpack all of these issues and explore what is happening across states and learn more about both the educator and parent perspective on these shifting standards. We have an expert panel who will take the findings from the B-Flation report to the next level by discussing importance of state standards aligning with NAEP, the trends in shifting standards across states, and what parents do and do not understand about what is happening in terms of the ratings for their children's proficiency and what they can do to get more information. The discussion will shed light on what can be done to ensure, by all of us, to ensure kids continue to accelerate their learning, even in the wake of COVID, rather than lower the bar that determines their ratings. And we are very lucky to have an expert on the B-Flation report with us to moderate today's conversation. We are so happy to welcome back Tracy Potts, who is the advisory board chair at Learning Heroes. She is a passionate advocate for equity and family engagement, having trained parents how to speak up for their child and support learning. She is the executive director of the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College, a former NBC reporter, and formerly served on the board of the National PTA. And now I'm honored to welcome and briefly introduce our esteemed panelists with us today in alphabetical order. And please note that I've already posted full bios in the chat, linked in the chat. So I'm just previewing quickly who we have with us today, and I'll make sure that we'll repost that link shortly. Jim Cowan is the executive director at the Collaborative for Student Success, a nonprofit dedicated to lifting and defending strong practices and K-12 education policies driving improved outcomes for all students. Prior to his role at the Collaborative, he served as a U.S. naval officer and honed his experience in communications and public relations during his time as a senior vice president at Ogilvy Public Relations Worldwide. Christy Hovanitz is a senior policy fellow for Excel in Ed, focusing on school accountability and math policies. Christy served as the assistant commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Education and assistant deputy commissioner at the Florida Department of Education. She has worked in education policy for the state of Florida since 1999. Jose Munoz is president at the Education Commission of the States and is a nationally recognized leader in developing key partnerships with state and local governments, school districts, teachers unions, nonprofits, and businesses. Before his current role, he was director of the Coalition for Community Schools at the Institute for Educational Leadership. Carrie Rodriguez is Matthew, Miles, and David's mom and the visionary founder and president of the National Parents Union, a groundbreaking organization that unites parents from diverse backgrounds to advocate for the rights, economic and educational needs of America's children. Under her leadership, NPU has become a formidable force, driving policy reforms and fostering parental empowerment. So welcome to all of you. We look forward to engaging with you and learning from you. And now I'm very excited to turn it over to Tracy to get the conversation going.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you all for being here. It's so important for us to have this conversation at this time. And I'm going to take a cue from Carrie and introduce myself as Jessica, Anna, and Andrew's mom, and Jaden and Kelly's grandma. And I think that's important. I'm so glad that you did that because this is our why. This is for many of us our why as to why we're here, and certainly is for me. Just a couple of brief comments before we start this conversation, because I think it's important for people to understand not only our titles and the work that we're currently doing, but a little bit more of that why and why we are so passionate about education. For me, it's been a thread throughout my life. It started with, I have images of my mom sitting in parent conferences with my teachers, and that set a standard for me that families are supposed to be involved in education. It set a standard for me really early on. Professionally, I became a local and then on national level, a reporter. And part of what I did was report on education. Locally, I remember I had the opportunity to report on some new and innovative things back then, like year-round learning and things like that. And so even as a young professional, this thread continued through my life. Then I became a mom, and parenting and that parent role and involvement in education became very real for me, to the point where I became a family engagement advocate, and some people call it expert, but certainly an advocate, helping other families and sort of shepherding through that process of what is it that I need to know or understand to be a real partner in my children's education. And that led to opportunities to serve with the National PTA and Learning Heroes, and to be the spokesperson for their Go Beyond Grades campaign. Certainly a lot of this really for many of us came to a flashpoint during the pandemic, where we really had to focus on how to do education differently in a way that we had never done before. And so it's important for us as we move forward now to help families understand their role in that and really understand the data that's being put out there, sometimes for the purpose of doing it in a helpful way, but sometimes a little challenging for folks to unpack. And so I have this great group of experts and advocates and all of this expertise in the room with us today to talk a little bit about that. So Jim, I'd love to start with you. The Collaborative for Student Success coined this term honesty gap over a decade ago, started using this term, and I'm wondering if you can sort of break down for us what was meant by that then, and what does it look like? How's that evolved over the years?
Yeah. First, thanks for having me. And this is such a great topic and such a great panel to be here. So I appreciate the chance to join everyone. So when talking about the honesty gap, I think it's important that we first do a little bit of a rewind to when this all came about, which was 2015, which feels like an eternity ago. But my organization, the Collaborative, at that time was being led by Karen Nussel, who I don't know if Karen's on the call tonight, but if she is, I hope she's doing well. Um, but she was helping us to lead a lot of work as a communications and engagement firm around raising expectations for students through rigorous standards in math and English, through supporting educators who would work to get to that standard, and then using some sort of strong system of measurement to gauge where students stand. Not entirely different than what we're doing right now, and not an outlandish concept, but we were simply focusing on raising the bar, helping students meet that bar, and then measuring what you're doing, right? We had a number of great examples at that time that we would push out to sort of gauge and promote the simplicity of this, right? You would want your doctor, of course, to be trained to a certain standard. You would imagine athletes win only when they're training to a specific standard, and service members deploy only when they're demonstrating some sort of mastery of the combat systems that they're going into the field with. But the communications environment around this was red hot. I mean, not entirely different than what it is right now, but there was enormous amount of politics, both at the state level and at the national level. There were concerns about federal overreach. There was confusion, anxiety about shifts in how students got to answers. And so there's an enormous amount of distraction. And it became incredibly hard to discuss something that just on its surface seemed as reasonable as having consistent academic expectations for our kids, right? So the idea of the honesty gap was really born out of this desire to kind of cut through that distraction and focus really on a very simple but critical point, and that is that parents deserve the truth about where their kids stand on their educational progress. And so to make that actually work, we needed to build both public and political will to build that sort of environment for it. So here's what the idea was. The idea was basically that since we believed that the National Assessment on Educational Progress was indeed, or NAEP, as you've been sort of teeing up here, NAEP is the nation's report card. It's the most rigorous representative gauge we have of student proficiency. We really shouldn't see a big difference between state proficiency rates and state NAEP results, right? I mean, that's the idea if we are indeed going into this that way. But that's not what we found. As we started to look at this, some states had gaps of well over 40 percentage points. So in other words, a state may be saying that 40% more of their kids are actually proficient than what the NAEP scores were actually showing. It's a huge gap. That's a huge difference. And so, you know, what we were trying to do with the honesty gap then is to determine why was that, or at least raise those questions. Other things we found with this first round of it was that more than half the states were being dishonest to parents about using either weaker standards or easier tests or lowering the cut scores or some combination of the three of them. So what we did with that was we made a very big deal out of this. We did an enormous amount of PR and campaign, and by presenting an entire national comparison of states. It still exists at honestygap.org if you want to take a look at that. We did at the time with the group Achieve with their analysis from the 2015 NAEP. To be honest, since we're talking about honesty, it upset quite a few states. And I would imagine that it made it really tough for organizations like my friend Jose's here, because it harshly criticized the states for what they were doing. So I can only imagine that's a tough place to be in from a communication standpoint. But it also showed that a number of states were doing a really good job of being honest as well. And so for those states, we held them up. We did a lot to promote that they were doing a good job of being truthful to parents. We did a second honesty gap in 2018 based on the same Achieve analysis, but from the 2017 NAEP. There's a big change when this one came through. There were at least 18 states, I think it was 18, improved at least around 10 percentage points by closing that gap in fourth grade reading and eighth grade math since around 2013. That was great. And we did a ton to promote the fact that states did a really good job closing that gap and try to put as much attention into those that did well as those that we criticized. So bottom line, Tracy, this was an impactful effort. It put a huge spotlight on holding students to higher expectations and being transparent about your data. States were promoting the fact that they had shrunk their honesty gap, which was great. Fast forward now about till 2020, till March of 2020. And for me personally, this is the moment that some of you may remember, but it was the start of the NBA game between the Utah Jazz and the Oklahoma City Thunder. Game canceled, season canceled, World Health Organization declares a global pandemic same day, schools shutter, and it feels like we just kind of, we go into the craziness that is the pandemic. And then so in looking at the comparison, then we're now considering NAEP scores for kids that took the test before schools shuttered. And so we're looking at this in the middle of the pandemic at scores that happened before the schools were shuttering. It was now getting muddied. So the dissonance was happening here. So the results were pretty much mismatched with the grades that students were taking home. We also started seeing bad results on 2022 NAEP, declining ACT scores. There were formative assessments that weren't looking good, and then state similar assessments were looking good. But yet the grades that were going home were looking pretty good. And so this was around the time when the B-Flation report came out from Learning Heroes, which I think did a great job of shedding a light on that and pointing out that 8 and 10 parents believed that their kids were actually on grade level, when in reality it was only 4 and 10 that were meeting those standards. So that created, I think, a really good platform to sort of reconsider things and say, like, okay, where are we now? Like, is it
Yeah.
time for a new honesty gap? But what would that look like? And I think the short answer is yes. I mean, but we're kind of in this moment now where we're seeing in many tones and media about we're questioning the pandemic recovery efforts and how they performed. Policymakers are showing probably less appetite to take on big questions around assessment, school accountability, and there's now like this ample opportunity for states to sort of have an appearance of success and potentially lowering expectations for kids. And then conversely to that, there's not a whole lot of incentive for a state to sort of hold their bar high now. There's
So
also
let
been
me
trouble.
put a pin in it right there, Jim, just so we can dig into some of that stuff that you brought up. Thanks for sharing that history. I think it's really important for people to understand sort of the foundation and the history of where we've come from. Data transparency is important. Nuance is a former journalist or a lifelong journalist, I like to say. Sometimes we don't do nuance really well, sometimes in quick things. And so you brought up the states. You talked a lot about this core issue of the states and the state standards versus NAEP standards. So I want to turn to Jose. Jose, by the way, worked with our students on one of the state reports that we worked on at the Eisenhower Institute, along with Emily, and was really helpful in providing some really useful information about community schools. And so it's great to have the chance to work with you again. So let's talk about the states, and let's talk about what you're seeing in terms of these shifting standards, and help us understand the story of why these shifts are happening at this time, and what the states are thinking about when it comes to NAEP and learning recovery.
Thank you, Tracy. And thanks to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for putting this together and putting together a very esteemed panel. Jim, you couldn't be more right. It's tough in this role right here when reports like that come out. But just want to folks, again, I'm Jose Munoz, President for Education Commission of the States, to tell you a little bit about us. We're a national education policy organization that really serves and helps our state policymakers in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and our U.S. territories for about almost 60 years now. We're nonpartisan, we're unbiased, and we cover the full spectrum of education issues from early learning to workforce. So we believe in the power of learning from experience, meaning that we use what we know about state trends and approaches across the country, and we just kind of aim to help policymakers make some better informed policy decisions. We do that in a variety of ways, through research and publishing our reports that folks can get on ecs.org, hosting convenings and having these conversations Jim talked about, and even providing counsel when necessary. So we research and report on trending education topics, and often invited to talk to groups like you all. So I really appreciate that. So this conversation about the honesty gap, where it describes as you were saying, the gap in proficiency rates between NAEP scores and state assessment scores. We are a firm believer in the use of data and have conversations with state policymakers often about data, even as you see the National Governors Association and Governor Polis's initiative really lifting up the data. So this is an important conversation right now. ECS, although when I found out coming to this role, my 10th month now, actually was the developer and administrator of NAEP for about 15 years. So it's going to lift that up as well too. So there's the big thing that seen in this conversation, and I hear the conversation about transparency, and as really what I'm hearing is that the broader challenge is really ensuring that families receive accurate and usable information. I'd be remiss not to mention, I love the way you started introducing yourselves. It's like, I'm a father of 5, so I get it. students who went to school in several different states. So 5 kids now that they're adults. But generally, the percent of students that are identified as proficient by NAEP is lower than a percent proficient as identified by state. So NAEP data is that reality check, the state data that Jim was talking about. There is some debate around the interpretations. So NAEP and state assessments, they're not intended to measure the same thing right now. So a bit of caution should be taken in some direct comparisons right now. So being proficient is not considered the same thing as being on grade level, as Jim was talking about a little bit earlier, which refers to the performance of local standards. There are, I'll lift a few big bucket ideas that I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about, Tracy, so we can meet the other folks and give them a chance to. So just on improving communication results with parents, states can do that to improve the communication with folks. I like to lift up like Amy Gadara in Virginia, who wrote an op-ed about a year ago. This time she points to Virginia's efforts to prepare data reports that tell the truth about where every student in school stands. And this year, for the first time ever, schools sent every parent and teacher the same understandable, actionable proficiency report showing a clear picture of how their students were performing and offering a discussion topics to support student success. So there's other bills out there, the recent bills that came up in Minnesota and Ohio and Texas and Virginia, who are looking at communication about assessment data as well. Then there's some assessment design changes. Montana lifting one up, granted the authority to use a 3-year assessment model. So I just want to lift that up. And then another one, the accountability to the system changes. So states, they made efforts to make school ratings more meaningful to the public, such as in Indiana replacing its A through F grading scale with school report cards that provide information on some key data points about school performance, or Nevada legislation in 2023 that developed some new accountability metrics for school districts to increase accountability and transparency. And then I'm sure the discussion will continue about the changing of cut scores. Although there are several examples of states that have lowered cut scores or proficiency levels. One example who raising cut scores has been Alabama. Their State Board of Education recently increased the cut score for the reading portion of the Alabama comprehensive assessment program. So I just want to kind of lift up a couple of things that states are doing as the conversation goes, but I do want to make space for a conversation to happen as well. Thanks, Tracy.
Appreciate that. Yeah, thanks, Jose. I appreciate those examples of design changes and data transparency and reporting, and really want to get and we will get hopefully very soon into the changing of cut scores up or down and what that looks like. And I'm really interested in digging into with Carrie, like, what does this all mean for families? You know, for those who are on the call, but for those of us who help families, to help us understand, it's one thing giving people more data, but giving it to them in a way that they can comprehend and understand is really important. So put a pin in that. Carrie, before I come to you, I want to talk to Christy, who works within Excel in Ed, another great organization. Early in the pandemic, Learning Heroes actually did a session on distance learning at your Edpalooza. And so another great partner in really helping people understand this. You have actually been following some states very closely. So I wonder if you might take a couple of minutes and break down for us what's happened recently in Wisconsin, in Oklahoma, and Alaska, and a little bit on your perspective of why some of these states are shifting now, and how they're informing parents of these shifting standards.
Sure. Thanks, Tracy. Want to just start though by talking about the whole reason we're having this conversation around cut scores is because all states have a set of content standards, which are set by educators in each state to specify what kids are supposed to know and be able to.
Was that just me, or did Carrie freeze up on us for a sec?
I think Carrie froze up.
Okay, so I will wait a minute to see if we can get that resolved. We can definitely, okay, thanks. So it looks like she did freeze. We can definitely come back around to that because from talking
Carrie,
to
if
Carrie,
you can hear us, maybe you can call in because you were about to say something really, I'm sorry, Chrissy, if you can hear us, maybe you can call in.
I'm sorry, Chrissy. Yeah. I was
Maybe,
looking at Carrie and saying, Christy, sorry about that.
because you were saying something really important, but yeah, go ahead, Tracy, sorry.
No, thanks for breaking in. I appreciate that. So we will see if we can get Christy back online, audio or not. In the moment, it looks like she's in the process of trying to do that. Carrie, I'm gonna hop over to you and I wonder if you can sort of fill in and okay, so break this all down in terms of what it means for parents and this point that Jose brought up about presenting information to parents in a meaningful way, in a way that they can understand. Understandable, I think, was the word that he used. This is really also my entree into this work and how I got into this work. And so I wonder if you might talk about in New York, but also in other states that you're familiar with. What is the information that parents need and they're not getting right now?
So I want to just start from overall, this really leads to chaos and you don't know who to trust. You don't know what information to trust. Things are coming at you from all different angles. You're getting national data, you're getting state data, you're getting local report cards, interim assessments, all these different things. And a lot of the time it's really contradicting information. So there's one thing that I can say for sure that every parent feels, and that is helpless, because what we desperately want to do is to take action around any of this data so that we can better support our kids. So, in New York, the reaction amongst parents has really been mixed. I think a lot of folks are very anxious about new standards, how that might affect their children's education, particularly after seeing learning disruptions over the last few years. And all of this data for us has a consequence. It's not just about collecting a piece of paper at the end of the stage after 12 years of education. We're talking about keeping the promise to our kids that if you do well and do your hardest and we all support you, that you're going to be prepared to access economic opportunity and mobility, and you're going to have a better and easier life. And regardless of what pathway you pick, if you need to be taking an aptitude test because you want to join the IBEW up in Boston and be an electrician, you've got to be able to pass that test and show that you are math proficient, reading proficient, you understand science. If you want to be able to go to a community college or a four-year college, you've got to test in to see where you place to make sure you can actually take a college level course. And when we're getting conflicting data, from all different sources, it doesn't make it possible for us to take the actions and get the resources necessary to get our kids to proficiency and be a good part of the team. And what's also frustrating is often that data is used to weaponize against parents, and we're held accountable. So often it's like, well, why didn't you know? And why didn't you do something? But I can tell you as a parent, and again, I have three boys that are mine, and I have two bonus sons. So I got 5 boys between 6th and 11th grade. So we're really in the thick of it over here. And last year we were really struggling. I had a 7th grader who was struggling to write a sentence. He was doing a book report on Roberto Clemente and he was struggling just to be able to put the thoughts together and to actually spell the words correctly. But when I take a look at his report card that was coming home, the kid was on the honor roll. He was getting A's and B's. And so every indication that I had was that, he's doing great. And you look at the comments, man, he's a joy to have in class. He is, he even has a strong sense of social justice. I would argue he actually learned that at home, but I digress. The thing is, I could see him struggling. I'm not an educator, I'm a parent. And it was very obvious to me. It was only when we got his MCAS data in Massachusetts that's our statewide assessment that frankly is under attack right now in a ballot question, that we got any indication that he was not meeting expectations. And so the only action I could take after having conversations with his teachers that assured us that everything was all right was to take him to Sylvan Learning Center and get him an iReady test, and pay that $100 and get my own assessment and my own data to say, oh my gosh. And when it came back, finding that he was 2.5 years behind grade level in reading, was I relieved that I wasn't crazy? Yeah. Was I very angry and frustrated because, it was very obvious to me, and I feel like I'm being lied to by the folks that are spending, 6.5 hours a day with my kid? Absolutely. That erodes the relationship. That erodes so much about that sacred trust that we're supposed to have as parents with educators. So, and that's why in our organization, the states that we work with, and we have 1,800 affiliates in all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, we reach about 1.7 million families as members of the National Parents Union. And what we're doing is not waiting. We're doing our own analysis. And in New York State, my state director, Ashara Baker, took the bull by the horns and said, you know what? We're going to do our own state report card, and we're going to start holding the state accountable. We're going to start holding districts accountable and saying, okay, here is all the data that we're being presented with. So who's telling the truth? And when we get down to it, is this really about kids or is it about adults? Are we changing the metrics because the adults don't like the story that the data tells? So we've got to change the assessment and move the measures because it's hard work to do right by kids and get them to proficiency. So we'd rather just kind of mess around with what proficient actually means. No, our kids deserve better than that, because the consequence is them not being able to be competitive in a global economy. And, that is not a joyful life where you can't get a job that can provide for a family and you can't participate in your community because you're working 2 crappy jobs, 3 crappy jobs. That's not the life that we want for our kids. We want better.
So, Carrie, I feel like either we have the same kids or we're the same parent, because I've been through some of those same experiences, right? And then I went outside the school system to see if I could get extra support for my child. My situation, what I found was that it ended up, the testing was somewhat helpful in revealing. The support was not, because it wasn't really aligned with the same curriculum and learning. So I ended up spending a lot of money that didn't help my child. That's also an equity issue, because not everybody has the opportunity to even do that. So I appreciate you sharing that. And the conflicting data is, there's the essence of what we're talking about here, right? So the conflicting data is challenging, and we are hoping that conversations like this move us forward to a place where we can make this clearer to parents, and most importantly, that kids and their achievement is at the center. You brought up something that Christy mentioned. I say you're back. Great, Christy. We're glad. I want to come back around to you, because Carrie brought up something that you mentioned in an earlier conversation, which was about we live in a competitive global economy, and I now work on the college level, and I see, my job is to prepare them the next step to kind of get out into that world, and I see the deficits that have happened, and I see the challenges to that every day. But let's go back a little bit. Christy, you were making a point. So I'd asked you about some specific states, and you really kind of started out, you were just about to make a really sort of important overall point. So Mike's back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so educators set expectations of what kids are supposed to know and do, and then we determine what is enough to move on to the next grade, or enough for students to be successful in the future. And, in general, no one wants to hear their kids falling behind. So the easy thing to do is to just lower the cut score for what it means to be on grade level. We've seen a couple of states actually take very specific actions on this year. Wisconsin and Oklahoma both lowered their cut scores. And so what that means for students in Wisconsin is their state governor, Tony Evers, had served as state superintendent back in 2012. He raised cut scores to align with NAEP, so schools and parents were getting the same information between what the state says and what the national test says. But before that happened, there was a 50-point gap. 86% of Wisconsin kids were proficient on the 8th grade reading test in the state, but on NAEP, it showed only 35% of kids were proficient. He rectified that, and there was no gap between NAEP and state proficiency. This past year, the Wisconsin education chief went back and rolled back that alignment. So now this year, there will be a huge gap between what the state and NAEP says is proficient. And that 50-point gap that we're going to see is going to represent tens of thousands of kids that aren't going to be identified and getting services that they need in order to be successful. Oklahoma did something very similar. They widened their gap after having it within 1 point of state and NAEP in fourth grade reading, it's now a 23-point gap. So 22% of students who were deemed proficient this year were not last year. And so now we're saying lower expectations are good enough, and we're impacting on this post-COVID new baseline. And so now we're saying what students need to know and be able to do isn't what the educator said that they had to do last year. And that's a real challenge, because we're not going to get kids to be ready and prepared in order to move on to the next grade. Alaska's also been cited as a state that has lowered their expectations, but I take a little bit of exception with this. Alaska, when they revisited their expectations, were very much aligned to NAEP. And in fact, their expectations for math were far more rigorous than what NAEP said. So their state proficiency on their math test was much lower than what NAEP expected for proficiency. So they corrected to align. So it looks like they lowered their standards, but they were just coming more in alignment with what NAEP said, rather than being far more rigorous than what the NAEP expectations were. So their situation is very different than what Wisconsin and Oklahoma have done. There are also some really good actors right now. Arkansas just earlier this month raised the rigor on their cut scores. They had a new test come online. They expect as much or more from kids as they did last year, and are still very closely, even more closely aligned with NAEP expectations. And then other states, some of which we heard Jose talk about earlier, Mississippi and others, have remained committed to those rigorous cut scores. And this is really important, because if a student is being told that they're proficient and the teacher doesn't have as much incentive to provide additional help or tutoring for that student moving forward, even though what it means to be proficient this year is different than last year. And for students, that also might mean that they're not going to be successful in higher grades. They might still be struggling in higher grades. And post-secondary, they might need remediation, which is going to add time and expense to their education. And they might not be competitive in the marketplace. This also is a challenge for educators and schools, because they can lose out on resources or training if all of a sudden all of their students are proficient. They don't need help with students that might still be struggling. And these lower proficiency expectations really resonate nationally with the business community as well, because they'll continue to struggle to find students who can fill high demand, high wage professions if they're coming out and they're not well prepared in reading and math.
Christy, I'm glad you popped back on because I think those examples were really important, and I want to bring everybody into a discussion of some of this now. Emily just popped into the chat and reminded us that the cut scores are defined as what determines whether or not a student is proficient, and when that's sort of feels like a sliding scale, right? So I'm talking from the parents' perspective here. When it feels like there's a sliding scale here, well, they were proficient last year, they weren't this year. This can be really confusing, I think was the word that you used, Carrie. I mean, if the scale has changed or the standard has changed, and last year my student was not proficient and now they are proficient, as a parent, I'm thinking, oh, great, but it may not be oh, great if the scale or the standard has changed. So I'm wondering if we can have sort of a larger discussion about, first of all, basic and proficient. Like, can somebody kind of help us better understand what this looks like and what this means, so that parents, but those of us who work with helping parents understand the system, can get a better understanding of that?
Sure, I can do that from the NAEP perspective. The National Assessment Governing Board, who oversees the National Assessment for Educational Progress, created this really great document to show some examples. So at fourth grade, a reader who is at the basic performance level could determine the relevant meaning of familiar words using context from a section of informational text. So that's a basic achievement. A proficient reader could provide an opinion using relevant information from the text, compared to an advanced reader that can distinguish a theme of the text. So they provide very specific examples of what it looks like to be a basic versus proficient or an advanced reader. In math, similar examples, a grade 4 kid who's basic could locate a number on a whole number on a number line. A proficient kid would be able to add and subtract multi-digit numbers, fractions, decimals, in problem solving. And an advanced kid could compare and order whole numbers, fractions, and decimals to the hundredths. So just
Gotcha.
the examples that they're giving is a great document if you're looking for specific examples.
That's helpful. So I also want to remind, I see that Emily is doing it in the chat, but I also want to verbally remind everyone that I have a bunch of questions, and I'm sure you probably have a lot of questions as well. Please put them in the Q&A feature so that we can address those coming up. And I also wanted to go back to something that Carrie said. It reminded me so much of the essence of that B-Flation report that we did with Gallup and Learning Heroes did, which essentially talked about the fact that when parents are just looking at grades, those grades reflect a lot of things that aren't specifically achievement, right? So your child turns in their homework. It may be right, it may be wrong. I learned as a parent, it may not even get graded at all. But the fact that they made the effort helps. They're participating in class. That's a really important, that's not something to ignore. It helps the learning process. But all of this is sort of mixed into those grades, but it doesn't clearly tell us improvement, right? So if your fourth grader is on a second grade level, and now all of a sudden they're reading on a third grade level, that's an entire year of improvement, but they're still not where they need to be. And so that's why I think it can be so confusing. We've talked a lot about the state. So Jose, I want to come back to you because I know you represent lots of different states or you work with lots of different states doing lots of different things for lots of different reasons. So kind of maybe help us walk through and understand what are some of these differences and complexities. I live in Maryland. I've had kids in school. My granddaughter's in school in Georgia. My grandson is here. My son is out in California. Can we look at what all states are doing differently? Transparency is one thing, but are there different challenges that different states are facing that kind of help us understand some of this?
Well, I think just some of the conversations that I say Christy lifted up and Carrie lifted up. There's all context always matters in states and where they are, who's making the decisions as well. I kind of heard through the conversations the several data points. I'm trying to remember them all. There's great inflation. I heard, which is from a parent standpoint of 5, that's really district controlled mainly. Then there's the cut scores you guys talked about. Yes, states kind of control that as well, responsible for that. And then there's the state assessments that blend with the state assessments, and then there's NAEP. I think confusing for me when I was a younger parent and having a daughter go through the same thing as Carrie, you were describing as one of your 5 sons. One of your 5 sons going through where she was getting outstanding grades at the school level only to get the assessment to come back, and then knowing my folks in New Mexico and how hard they work. I think some of Tracy, to answer your question as far as what states experience as well, they get guidance from the federal government as well. I think the main thing I keep coming back to, what I hear, and having been a parent and working in communities, so many communities as often as I had in my career, communication is so key to parents and the transparency pieces of it. It's great to hear Christy kind of affirm that states are actually looking to improve. Like even the example of Alaska, say, oh man, we went a little bit too rigorous. We're trying to align. Well, I shouldn't say too rigorous. I think challenge is good. Being challenged is really good. I think most of us parents would rather know our kids get a score that needs improving. We'd rather know ahead so we can continue to challenge them, supporting that challenge. But it's good to hear that states, what we hear often, Tracy, is that states are looking to learn from each other and to improve their conditions, as some of the conversations that have been had here. The struggle is that we all hear struggles, and when it becomes confusing to themselves or the constant change within 4-year cycles of people, it's hard to maintain a reform without the longevity of the reformers in that state trying to make those changes. So I think that going back to what Jim said earlier in his opening comments, Jim, what I have seen work, what I know work is when the conversation could be blended with professionals such as yourselves, their community members. So you pretty much have transparent conversations going both ways. So the struggle always is the timing of when things have to happen. Communication is so key to the transparency piece and our frustrations as parents, our frustrations as policymakers.
So I want to bring Jim back into the conversation. I'm glad you ended that way, Jose, because in that project, so I mentioned briefly earlier in that project that my students worked on, where you came in and you talked to them at that time about community schools and the value of that. We were looking at one state, the state that I live in, Maryland, and one of the things that I saw very clearly was that when we started looking at and comparing, I built this, big database. Emily was like, "What are you doing? I have this huge database." And one of the things that we saw were the differences in state reporting and NAEP. And I remember thinking, as somebody who was an education advocate, and then I looked and I was like, why are there more kids proficient here than here? Like, why are they saying this many kids are proficient in this county, but the national is saying something else? So Jim, you work on behalf of student success, right? So when we talk about, Jose talked about communication, one of the things that we emphasize in this B-Flation report is the communication between parent and educator and the very important role of developing that relationship, so that parents are not only getting the right information, but understanding the right information. But I kind of want to toss it to you to address that communication piece. And because there's another level of communication, right? Higher than the parent educator role. How are you feeling about that?
So it's a great point, and this is complicated, right? Like that's why Jose, I so empathize with you because this is not done in a vacuum. It's very easy sometimes to sit in the back seats and throw stones from my office in Washington D.C. about a state that didn't raise the standards without sitting in the chair of the educators and the policymakers that are in our state that are really committed to doing well by the state of Maryland, or state of state of whatever. I don't believe that they have that they're actually trying to harm kids, but there are so many political elements at play that have to be mitigated as well on that level. So I think everyone's trying to find the grace in the middle where, as a parent, you're like, number one is my child. Is I have to take care of my kid and make sure that they're getting the best instruction possible and that we're getting the best information possible. And at the political level, you have people who are dealing with resources. That's another thing we really haven't talked about with assessments and accountability. The better the data that we get from these tests should be helping us apply resources in a better way as well through a state. And I think that's an important factor. But the communication, there are things that are very real that are complicating this. There have been arguments that, well, shouldn't we, kind of reset after the pandemic because it was difficult. The kids got set back. So isn't that a reason to set back on our standards? I think the answer is no. It's more reason than ever that we should be really providing good data and that we should be doing everything we can to increase the level of instruction. The jobs are going to continue to be what the jobs are. The jobs aren't going to change. The economy is not going to change. The demands for us to make sure that our kids are filling those roles is not going to change. So that continues to put the demand on us. I'm not saying it's easy, but I just lean towards the transparent nature of this. As the most important thing. Like you can't run from the data. The data has to be out there for people to understand, and they gotta see it. One other point I'll make is around the other things that have happened recently. Mental health is real for kids in school. Chronic absenteeism is real. But again, these are all things that I think that we can't run away from because they are there and we have to deal with them if we're going to help these kids meet the jobs that are waiting for them.
I want to talk about those jobs, but Carrie, I saw you shaking your head when Jim brought up the question, hey, post-pandemic, learning was interrupted significantly, certainly for some communities and some kids more than others. It's shown a light on things that were already going on. Should we be shifting proficiency standards to get back on track? And I heard Jim and I saw you shaking your head. No, we should not. Tell me about that.
Because we're setting our kids up for failure. I mean, we're
And I-
lying to them. We are lying to our children. We are lying to parents, and we are setting them up for a disastrous future because, I hear a lot about, we want our kids to be joyful learners. I want my kid to be happy, but I want them to have a happy, joyful life. Okay. And my kids can't eat joy if they can't get a job because they don't know how to read.
I
And
want my
that's not
kids
a
not to be in my basement forever. That means they have to be able to get a job. That means they got to be able to read. Is that
Like,
what we're doing?
yeah, and you know what?
Right?
We also have to teach our children to overcome challenges and diversity, that they have to demonstrate proficiency, because guess what? If they want to do anything in life, they're going to have to do that. You want to be a nurse, you have to pass the NCLEX, right? You have to pass the bar exam. If you want to be a medical assistant, you've got to pass an exam. You want to do anything, you have to demonstrate proficiency. I equate it often because, again, in Massachusetts, we're having a lot of conversation about the MCAS exam here, and about, oh my gosh, we should not have a state graduation requirement around standardized testing. And, oh, it stresses kids out. You know what really stresses kids out in the 10th grade? The driver's license test too, and, we have standards. And we have excellent driver's ed teachers, but there's no way in hell we would ever say, we're just going to expose you to great content and hope that you get, we're not going to make you demonstrate proficiency. We're not going to make you pass the test. But these are the ridiculous conversations that we're having now because our kids have been through an unprecedented challenge. It's just not setting them up for anything that's realistic. And I want to say one other thing about communication. This is something that is very puzzling to me. And I've been in the parent advocacy space for about 10 years, since I started advocating for my son, who's now an 11th grader. And I've learned a lot from Learning Heroes and the surveys about report cards, because it is the most powerful communications tool that schools have with parents. We trust it. We believe in it. What you tell us there is actionable. It lights us up. We understand it as long as it's used well. We used to get that like A through F thing, and now we change it up. But it is literally the most trusted communications tool that we have with families, and we don't use it effectively. There are 63 million parents in this country with kids under the age of 18 that are looking at those report cards. It's a hell of a lot easier to change report cards so that they're better understood by parents than it would be to change our behavior through the excuses we hear. Well, that's just a snapshot, and you shouldn't be thinking of report cards that way because it's not really demonstrating proficiency. Well, maybe it should. Maybe it should be telling us the things that you want us to know, so it's actionable and we can be part of the team and make sure that we're getting our kids to where we want them to be. Instead, like, I've seen report cards from across this country, so convoluted, crazy information. I don't need things I don't want graded, whether that's grit, love, all things under the sun. Like, we've got to be able to have a conversation about if we think it's important for parents to know that children are reading proficiently and on grade level, put it on the report card. We will read it and we will take action if it's not there. But we can't be afraid of parents. We can't be afraid of communicating. And this, to me, goes to, kind of bedside manner. When we have doctors, you can't avoid a painful conversation to tell a patient like they've got cancer or it's not looking good. You got to go in there and say, listen, we're in a tough spot. We got to figure out an action plan so we can get you healthy again. We got to do the same thing when we're talking about our kids' educational health. You can't be afraid of parents and families if you want us to take action. But again, I would argue, I don't know that it is really about parents and families and kids. It's about, some folks in the comments are actually asking the question about, like, how does politics come into play? And are we lowering scores because we're concerned about the political optics of having to come out and say, listen, the data's not good and we got to take action. We're not doing enough by our kids, and taking a political hit. And we see that play out on the local level, on the state level, and on the federal level. So I would argue again, are we playing with these numbers and these assessments because we're worried about how kids feel and being told that they're not ready after the pandemic? Or are we worried about how grown-ups feel about being told that you're not doing enough for kids and you need to do better?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, Carrie, because you mentioned that earlier and I wanted to ask you about it, but you've kind of unpacked it a bit for us because politics are also tied to money, right? So how are schools funded? How are, which schools get more resources, more teachers, more programs to help their kids are often tied to these proficiency levels. And if you have students who appear to be more students or a larger proportion of students who appear to be proficient, then maybe you don't need as many resources. And so there are lots of things that don't specifically point to the achievement of our kids that are driving the politics, the money tied to the politics that are driving some of this. Chrissy, you brought up a
Tracy,
really—
if I could real quick, Tracy, on that.
Go ahead, hop in, Jose.
So this is an opportune time for us in this conversation, especially with Governor Polis's initiative with the National Governors Association, that as he is chair for this called Let's Get Ready, Educating All Americans for Success, because they are going to be pushing really hard on exploring how to better evaluate the outcomes of state investments in education. So the appetite politically is there. I think the continued conversation. So Jim, what you talked about before in the report is right. Doing another report is right. Having Carrie and Christy and other many of us on this call right now having these conversations with our state officials, helping them and guiding them. There are many folks, especially that work in government, who are advising the politics of this. They're learning as well. Some of them haven't been educators. They've been parents like myself and like Carrie as well too. So I think the continued education and conversation needs to happen. I really do have a feel that the appetite for the learning and moving and having action on this is going to be coming up within this year in particular.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And by the way, I'm going to go back to that comment I said, but I don't want my kids in the basement forever. Like, so as a mom, I probably do, but but I think you guys
Hey,
all know where I'm
girl,
coming
say
from.
they can stay for as long as they want, but I want them to have a career.
But I want them to be independent. That was the point. I want them to have the ability to. They can
I
have
want
the
to retire
ability
from mine and have them take care of me. That's what I want.
I'll go in the
There you
basement.
go.
I'll go in the basement.
Yeah. Just give them the rest of the house, right?
Well, that depends with the basement. So
And then who knows? Maybe we don't even have a basement. Maybe they're just right there next to you on the sofa every single night watching your reruns with you. And you're like, oh my gosh.
Tracy, could I say just real quick, as
Yeah,
all these
please.
examples are being given, I so agree with the tone of the conversation too, about that. One, that we have to be honest about this information. As tough as it is, it's better than the alternative of not knowing, right? Like you should know, you have the right to know, and you should know and have the ability to act on it. And two, I always think about sports. Like for all of us who have kids who are in sports, to watch the dynamic of how we act with our kids to do better in sports world, we will do anything. We listen to every metric, we listen to every analysis and every report because we know it's probably accurate, and then we will take whatever steps we have to help that child, whatever, get a coach for whatever in hockey, basketball, soccer, you name it. I wish we would have the same sort of level of attention sometimes in how we look at kids in their educational progress.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to remind everyone to put your questions in the Q&A, because in about 5 minutes, we're going to start addressing those questions. And to your point, one of the things that we talked about during that Go Beyond Grades campaign and our B-Flation report is how do we help parents ask the right question of their educator? Because how many times, and I've been this parent, right? I'm the education advocate parent, as my kids like to call me, but I've been this parent who goes to the conferences or who calls and asks for a meeting with a teacher and says, how's my kid doing? So that's a really vague question. And it doesn't necessarily give you the same information as asking, is my child on grade level? And that's what we at Learning Heroes have really encouraged parents to do. So not to put the whole onus on parents, not to put the whole onus on educators, but really helping to train parents to ask the right question. Is my child meeting standards? Is my child on grade level? Because that opens, I think, a very different conversation. And back to the economic piece of this. So Christy, early on when we were having a conversation before the webinar, you brought this up and it really resonated with me. This goes beyond K-12. This goes way beyond K-12. And we've talked a little bit about that here. But when you think about, I've done education programs with right across the street here, actually, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Like, the business community should be really interested in whether we are appropriately segmenting or naming our kids as proficient, because these are their workers, not only of the future, but like these are the 16-year-olds who are running your cash register today. Talk to me a little bit about that connection.
You've nailed every single point. Education's just not for the sake of education. Education's for the sake of our economic development, for our citizenry, for our citizenship, to be a functioning democracy, to have upward mobility. I mean, this is bigger than just education. And we're not doing this just to, make schools look good. We're doing this to make the US a successful democracy. So I don't think I can highlight any more than what you've said. Is we need people to take these high wage, high demand jobs. We need people to participate in our economy and our citizenry.
So I'd like to begin to wrap this part of the conversation so we can get into the Q&A by asking each of you to weigh in on one final question, and that is this. What would you encourage the parents, the educators, the advocates who are listening to this conversation today to do? Like, what is the action step that we can take in the place where we are, from your perspective, in my community, in my school, in my state, to try to move the needle on this and to try to make sure that the focus remains on keeping the bar high and setting it high and high achievement standards for students, and then helping them get there? Because I think we're seeing some of the problems and the challenges very clearly. How do we start to move the needle?
I
I
would
can
say-
even, go ahead, Christy.
I would just say, especially in states like Oklahoma and Wisconsin, who have taken that step to lower expectations, when your child brings home the test score, compare it to what it said last year, and then wonder, did magic happen this past year? Did they just have the most phenomenal effective teacher this year? Find out what it is that changed in their test score year over year. And I know it's a challenge with all the other things we have going on, but being especially cognizant of the trend that you're seeing with your child, and to address it. Let it be known that you don't want lower expectations for your child. You don't want them to just feel good, that you want them to actually learn it and master the content standards you've set out for them.
Well, maybe this is also a place where districts and states can help, right? Maybe you can provide that information. Like, maybe show me what my child's score was last year versus this year, as opposed to, me trying to dig. I got I've got 3 kids. Carrie's got 5 boys, trying to remember like who got what last year. Like, maybe we can more transparently provide that so that people can see the evolution over the course of a year. Any other thoughts?
I just want to encourage folks, like I know what I'm going to tell my constituency, which is we're going to organize, we're going to hold you accountable for being transparent and being honest with us. And if you're not going to be honest with us, we're going to compare the data on our own. We're going to issue state report cards like we did in New York, and we're going to march that thing all around the state and tell every parent we can find that we need to hold you accountable. Now, for you guys who are here, who are different from my constituency, I'm going to issue a challenge to you. Like, I want to see you having courageous conversations. I want you to do the opposite of what you're doing now, which is thinking you're being kind to us by not being honest, not telling us the real deal, not giving us all the data, or when you do give us the data, it's in edunese and we don't know what you're trying to tell us. We really need you to be courageous and bold and meet us there, because when you do, I think you're going to be surprised. I think you're going to find parents who are ready to help, who are anxious to help, who feel relieved that they're not crazy, because like we see this stuff playing out in our living rooms. Like we may not be educators, but we're not stupid. We can tell when a kid is struggling to read, and we just don't, we don't have the strength. We're not educators. We don't know how to help them out. But if you tell us what to do and you tell us there's a problem there, we're going to get to work and we're going to be right there with you, because we have a vested interest in your success. We've got skin in the game and we want you to be successful, but we can't help unless you're willing to be courageous, be honest, and tell us where we really are so that we can do this together.
Gotcha. So compare your scores to your child's scores to last year. Be really honest and be ready for some advocacy on that issue. Jim, you want to weigh in on this? How do we move the needle piece? I've got about 30 seconds each for you and Jose before we move on to the Q&A. Final thoughts.
Well, my final thoughts is coming to it from an organization like that I've run, which is you got to keep people's feet to the fire. I think the thought that you don't say anything when you know that the data is telling you something else is unacceptable. You have to hold politicians' feet to the fire, and that's through, from my standpoint, it's advocacy, it's PR, it's trying to find the issues that are gonna get to people, that are gonna get to parents, and make them ask the right questions. Sometimes that is in being super critical on a state, but if it's the right information, you really owe it to putting it out there, and that's what we do.
Jose, you get the final word. You said that, you said that politically, this may be the time to have this conversation. What are your final thoughts about this?
Yeah, I've been an organizer for 25 of the 30 years I've been working as a professional. Tracy, you know this. And so sometimes, and this is not to take away from anybody else's comments, but how we hold maybe feet to the fire, Jim, to use your words, I would say be a little bit different. So I just recently came back last week from working with the state and organized a convergence of conversation between community members who were affected by policy or lack thereof of implementation, and heard a state senator, along with the lieutenant governor, along with a representative and the superintendent. The senator says, you know what? I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never heard that story, and it's not okay. So I would encourage people to organize conversations around a meal and have honest but respectful dialogue. I want my 5 children. I joined that group too. I've always wanted them to be challenged. And Jim, I'm a former professional athlete. I get that, and I want my kids to be challenged. But the way to get things done quickly takes the time and effort to have a conversation, an honest conversation, but respectful conversation. What it ended up to be in that was a misalignment of what people were experiencing and what people in policymaking roles hope was happening with the policies they chose. They left that with the plan of action to do that. So I would encourage folks on this call to have some honest conversations where folks aren't necessarily being called out, but there's a co-constructing what needs to evolve and what needs to happen for the children of our country.
Appreciate that. All right, Emily, I know you've got some questions.
I mean, I just love this because we heard it from Carrie, we heard it from Jose just now. You're all talking about how important it is for teachers / schools / state departments of education and parents to work together. And, the Campaign for Great Little Reading has long advocated that. And then I also just want to quickly share, I posted the Learning Heroes actually I posted it in the chat, their Go Beyond Grades campaign includes question prompts, includes ways, advice for parents on how you can have these conversations. And I'm sure the National Parents Union has some resources too. So check out their website as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with Lottie because she had a couple questions about ESSA. And I know Christy, everybody, these questions have been answered already, but I think they're good for a conversation. Her first question was, what are the implications for states shifting proficiency in relation to the ESSA mandates? And then her follow-up question is, can we move ESSA from the bell curve to the J curve? So I'm not sure. We could, Christy, if you want to go ahead and take a stab at that, and anybody else.
Sure. The first one, there will be implications. If you have more students proficient, fewer schools are going to be identified for supports and interventions, which means they'll miss out on resources and technical assistance for those students at the schools. I was asking Lottie to say more. What does she mean, L bell curve to J curve? So hoping for more clarification in the open question and answers.
Add some more details there, Lottie, if you can. Thank you. So I think this is a great question from Steve. Do we actually know whether or not NAEP or other standardized tests predict college or career or life success? I mean, we all know, we're all advocates for the whole child. We all know tests are not the only thing to look at, but that's what we're talking about right now, is like, what are those cut scores? What marks proficiency? That's what we're talking about today. So tell us what you know about, how these test scores, Carrie, you touched on this a little bit, talking about you have to have certain proficiency to get into the, the apprenticeships or the various trades, things like that. But tell us what you know about whether or not NAEP or other tests predict college and career readiness and success.
Yeah, there's been a lot of analysis of this. I mean, the new Annenberg study, Lifting All Boats, talks about this specifically. There's debate about, causation versus correlation, like you can get into the weeds about it. But I mean, what we can say is definitively that standardized tests overall are moderately correlated with academic achievement in college, and often predicting, first year grades. We don't do a great job of actually tracking data, as kids go off and achieve, career goals and whatnot. And we need to get better at that. But I do think that we do have an analysis that says that it can be a predictor, at least of some aspects of success.
And just to build on that for all of you, we are talking about cut scores and proficiency ratings and things like that. But what do you all recommend that we look at? There's the issue with the grades not meeting NAEP, but what are the other things that, our audience, our parents, our advocates should be looking at to know how well a student is doing in school, and especially post-COVID?
I'd say that skill development. I'd go back to what Carrie talked about her own child on the social skills and things. I mean, if we could do some measuring on that. So I'm an anomaly. I didn't test well. I didn't grade well either. But here I am as the president of organization. But I was able to have some applicable skills in the workforce world. Now, that's not to lessen the importance of having an aligned system of scoring and how to use that data to markedly move people through that more people than me, the anomalies of there. But I think also there's some pressure. We were talking about politically early, and I'm gonna sidestep a little bit, Emily. Early, I was sitting on an airplane next to the president of one state, I won't name the state's realtor association. We were having this conversation. So I just want to kind of throw that on there when people are thinking about the pressures of state folks and these scores here and how we can help them by letting them know we do want more challenging and we do want more alignment as well. I just wanted to throw that out there as part of my answer.
I think what Jose is saying is really important, because, there's the immediate implication and then there's the longer term implication. Again, in my home state of Massachusetts right now, we're having a conversation around statewide assessment and, whether or not it's harmful to kids, and what data do we have that says, whether or not it's harmful. I mean, I would argue that we have 95% participation rates, and, it seems to be pretty helpful in terms of raising everyone in Massachusetts. But, there's a reason why, in the middle of this campaign, you see the governor and the lieutenant governor and the attorney general and the Senate president and the speaker of the House all saying, MCAS is important. Standardized testing is important. Why? Because we have to have a prepared workforce. In Massachusetts, where you have some of the highest cost of living in the nation, when you're making that value proposition, you should actually come to Massachusetts. It's worth it, even though it's crazy to buy a house here. But we have the most highly competent, educated workforce, and we can demonstrate, I don't know whether or not you can do that if you don't have a standardized test that measures that, if we don't have NAEP scores that measure that. And, again, it has longer term impacts on other aspects of our economy. And there's a lot of, unintended consequences. These decisions that we make, they don't just impact education. It impacts our children's lives, well into the future.
And I think Leticia's question, and we just posted our feedback poll because we have about 10 minutes left. So we really, really take this feedback so seriously. So please take 2 seconds to just put in your responses to our questions as we're continuing with the Q&A. But I was just going to say, so Leticia's question here is, are the proficiency ratings relative to children with special needs or learning in special education classrooms? So kind of building on what you're already talking about. Any thoughts on that? I think, Christy, you responded to that.
I did. It obviously has implications for all students. So just students with disabilities, a majority of them still take the state assessment, either with or without accommodations. And those students with significant cognitive disabilities take the alternate assessment, which is also aligned to the state standards. So we want rigorous expectations for all kids. We don't want to say, oh, because a student has disabilities, we don't expect as much from them either, same as we would for any other student. So we need to make sure that we maintain and have rigorous expectations for those. I did get clarification for Lottie too on the S or the Bell versus the J curve. It's basically the conversation about a criterion system versus a normative system. We want all students to be proficient, and we don't rate them based on how well other students are doing. We don't want to rate schools based on how well other schools are doing. We want to know what an effective school is with respect to ESSA, and we don't want to just have a bell curve of saying there's always a top 10 performing schools and always the bottom 10% of performing schools. We need to set that expectation of what we expect for schools.
And I just got to push in as the mother of a child with special needs. Kids with special needs can absolutely demonstrate proficiency, if not excellence. I have a child who is a 10th grader who just passed the MCAS exam while in a therapeutic high school, a therapeutic setting last year. And this is a kid who, before we had standardized testing in Massachusetts, would have been taught life skills and how to make pizza boxes. This is a kid who could be a cybersecurity analyst. He is bright. He is brilliant. He just happens to have autism and a different lens. And those kids we used to give up on. And because he can demonstrate proficiency, he's going to go to Salem State. And there are so many other kids like him that should absolutely do the same thing and follow the same path.
I so agree, Carrie. And I had a special needs, one of my children with special needs as well. And not only can they demonstrate proficiency. So you talked earlier about standards and setting the bar high. There's data that shows that when we set the standards and set the bar high, our children achieve. Not only can they become proficient, but they can excel. Like they can go beyond proficiency. There's a whole, and we forget that there's a whole group of special needs students who are also gifted. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And I just think it's really important to point that out.
And I just want to go to Elizabeth's question here because Tracy, you finished by asking what can be done. And, she's expressing that teachers and educators are really hamstrung too, like if their schools are having this different levels and they don't have all the information that they need, they're not sure that their data they're reading is accurate enough. And so they don't really know whether or not how to engage with parents. So just any sort of feedback for the educators, any thoughts on what they can be doing that hasn't been said yet?
So I'm just going to roll out with this and just start with this very quickly. So family engagement is a lovely concept and we all talk about it and we all say we're doing it at different levels. But anything that you're doing, you got to put your money where your mouth is. So going a little bit beyond the educator level for districts and for states that help fund districts. If we want to do family engagement well, if we want to make those connections, if we want to empower families to be able to help their children, that needs to be in your budget. Teachers should not be, I say this all the time. Every email I got from a teacher came at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night, right? That's not really the right model for family engagement. They have their own families. And so I think we need to restructure budgets and restructure school to allow educators to do what they want to do, which is build those relationships and support families.
Any other thoughts on what that hasn't been said about, go ahead, Carrie.
I think it goes to pre-service. Like, we're not equipping teachers with adequate preparation on how to have good relationships with parents. And that's not their fault. It's something we don't value, so we don't teach them. And that's a problem. Again, going back to the medical examiner, or the medical example, like, you got to teach bedside manner. Like, doctors have to talk to patients, teachers have to talk to students, they have to talk to parents, right? And that's not something, that is so obvious all the time, because it can be hard, and these are hard conversations, and they're emotional, and there are highs and lows, and it's relationship building. These are human being lessons that folks need, because it can be scary. When I've seen the scared look in a 23-year-old brand new teacher's face when I'm sitting across from them, like, and they want, like, it's very nerve-wracking to have to sit across the table from a parent and deliver bad news. We should be doing more to support teachers and hold their hands and mentor them so that they can have good and effective conversation. And that starts in pre-service.
So we have this late breaking question from Eric, which is a good one. And he's referencing specifically parents of military connected kids, 1.2 million kids around the country who attend public schools, who are sort of selecting where their kids go to schools. So if there's such a big honesty gap, what is your advice for these parents on how they can go about making their decision on where their kids are going to go to school?
So I'll take that one, and I'll first say, like, DODEA, the Department of Defense Education Activity, is a huge resource for military connected kids, and they actually do a really awesome job on how they're set up, the communities that they have, and the supports and the assessments that they've given too. I think we've seen, I've written about this in the past. They've actually had really good results on their assessments, and there's a lot of questions about, well, what's the secret sauce? And I think there is a lot to be learned about the fact that they are in a kind of a closed community where there's direct access between parents and the school members and the base leadership. So it's not an apples to apples look at what kids are going through public school and what kids are going through in military schools. So there is a bit of an advantage there, but it doesn't change the fact that the military connected kids are moving every 2 years and have to deal with a series of stresses that are different. I would also argue that a lot of those stresses make them more resilient and stronger as they move too, and that's a benefit for them over time. But it needs to be recognized by the school systems that they're going into, whether that be middle school, high school, or otherwise, that they are experiencing some sort of stressors that are different than other kids in the class. Emily, I don't know if the question was more about, is there an honesty gap for military kids who might be homeschooled? I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that, because I don't know how you would measure that. And I don't know enough about the homeschooling to know what their individual programs would look like and what their assessments would look like. Chrissy, I don't know if you've got any background on that either, but I think each one of the kids who might have a homeschooling is a vastly different field that I am not
I had
familiar
a colleague who called it the wild, wild west of homeschooling.
Yeah.
Heard that before. Well, I think you did answer the question that was posed in the chat, as the way, or in the Q&A, the way it was posed. So thank you so much for that, Jim. You obviously have that experience. So Tracy, I'm going to go ahead and start our closeout. So I can't say thank you enough, Tracy, to you. You are a brilliant, brilliant moderator. This was such an incredible panel. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jose. I am just so thrilled for this conversation. I know the audience really appreciated it. And we're just going to close out by reminding you of some upcoming sessions that we have. And I want to say thank you to the audience. There were some really, really good comments posted in the chat. There was great questions posted in the Q&A. So thank you so much for your engagement. Here are upcoming sessions. I will post the links again in the chat for those of you who are still here. Please join us for upcoming sessions, and because all of them are going to be as equally interesting and compelling as today's was, right? Today was awesome. So thank you again, and everybody have a great afternoon and a great evening.